Yo, what's good? My name's Kang like Kangaroo, and in this video, I'm going to be telling you how you could potentially travel the world and also retire. Now, the main idea or how you would do this all boils down to the idea of CoastFIRE. So just as a quick disclaimer, FIRE is obviously financial independence, retire early, and CoastFIRE is this stage of FIRE where you're at, where you've invested enough money into your brokerage account that you no longer need to invest any money in order to reach your FIRE goal by your retirement age. That way you can just kick your legs back, just take a job that merely pays the bill, and coast your way to FIRE. So just as a quick example of this, say you had $500,000 invested at the age of 30 years old with the plan to retire at 60 years old. Now, if you never invest a single penny after your 30th birthday and you assume a 10% return on your investment over the span of 30 years, after 5 years, you have roughly $800,000. After 10 years, you have 1.3 million. After 20 years, you have 3.3 million. And after 30 years at the age of your retirement, which is now 60, you have over $8.7 million. Now, this is just some napkin math that is done very quickly on a compound interest calculator, and it does not count for a lot of variables like inflation or changes in your family life, etc. But I think it does a very good job of explaining the idea of CoastFIRE and showing you why time is on your side math-wise when it comes to investing. And I think most people can understand this idea pretty easily, but how does it extend to the idea of traveling and traveling to retire? Which leads me to talk about this Reddit post that I found a couple days ago. So shout out to the user over and over and over. In their Reddit post, they say, has anyone thought about spending the first few years of FIRE in a low cost of living country that allows their net worth to grow? They continue on to say, I'm thinking I could achieve FIRE a little bit earlier if I spent 5 years in Latin America or Southeast Asia or something, while I'm still young and hopefully won't need as much medical care. I'll be happy by a beach, hiking bum, and retiring relatively modestly. This will allow my nest egg to grow considerably so that when I'm a bit older, I can move to Europe or USA and have a high quality of healthcare, safety, etc. Anyone consider using this strategy? So the main thought process behind this post is the user is going to take advantage of the 4% rule and essentially currency arbitrage. So first off, the 4% rule is this rule of thumb that is often touted online when you're talking about retirement, which basically says that you can draw 4% of your portfolio every single year without the money running out, assuming that you're having a 30-year retirement. Now, obviously, you have to adjust this if you're planning to live more than 30 years, but I think the 4% rule is a good rule of thumb and a good way to understand how you actually implement retiring. And what this user is saying is that instead of withdrawing that 4%, they're going to withdraw like, I don't know, 1.5%, 2% and use the currency arbitrage by going to a country in Southeast Asia or South America where the cost of living is much cheaper and their dollars can stretch much further. So just as a personal anecdote, last year I went to Thailand and I spent 3 weeks there with my girlfriend, and I spent there 3 weeks for both of us around $1,300. This is excluding the flights to get to Thailand. Now, if you're living there longer term and you need to get cell phone, internet, apartment, all those sort of things, the cost definitely does rise. But based on my personal experience of being in Thailand, I can say that your dollar goes much, much further there than it does in Europe or even Canada or the US. So this idea where you're withdrawing 2% or 1.5% or 1%, whatever the amount is, and still letting your portfolio grow is the main idea behind being able to retire and also travel the world. Another commenter on this post has also mentioned the idea of what they're calling mullet FIRE, which is essentially upgrading the places that you're traveling to or living in as your portfolio grows. Now, let's say for this example, you're withdrawing 2% of your portfolio. Now, let's say after living in, for example, Thailand for the last 5 years, your portfolio has grown. And now when you're withdrawing 2%, you have a lot more money than is actually needed to live in Thailand. So you're thinking, okay, let's upgrade a little bit. Let's move to, say, for example, South Korea or Japan or whatever, right? And after another 5 years, 3 years, whatever, your amount has grown again where you're able to, again, upgrade where you're living and say, okay, now we're going to go to Eastern Europe. And the cycle continues and continues until you're able to reach the point where you can comfortably afford to retire back in your home country, say it's USA or Canada. But by doing this, it also comes with a significant amount of risk that I think is important to understand. Now, the first one is sequence of return risk. Now, the sequence of return risk all boils back down to math. Everything is just math at this point. But whenever you lose money, it's harder to gain back that money. So say, for example, you had a portfolio worth $100,000 and it lost 50% of its value. If it's lost 50% of its value, it's now worth $50,000. To get back to your initial $100,000, you need a 100% return on your investment, right? Does that make sense? And the reason it's called sequence of return is because it matters very much in when you're withdrawing from your portfolio and when your portfolio goes up and down in the stock market, if that makes sense. Because say, for example, you're working right now and your stock portfolio drops 50%. Yeah, it sucks, but it's not a huge deal because you're able to take advantage of those lows and keep investing, essentially buy the bottom. But while you're retired, you're no longer working. You're essentially relying solely on your investment as income while you're retired. Now, the second risk that I can think of is the assumption that your portfolio will grow while you're retired and doing this strategy. So a lot of studies online have said, oh, the stock market has returned 10% on average in the past 100 years, right? But it's important to note that that is over a long period of time, 100 years. In a time frame of 5 years or even 10 years, I don't think it's considered long enough to assume that you would have a 10% return over that whole entire period of time. So the risk comes is when you're traveling the world, you're assuming that your portfolio will continue to grow. You know, there is a chance that it does not. Basically what happens then is, like, if you want to go back to America or back to Canada or whatever, you probably have to continue working in order to supplement your income because your portfolio has not grown enough to where you can solely rely on it. So another drawback that I see is visa runs and taxes. Most places are like, okay, we can kind of understand you're coming here because it's cheaper cost of living, so they're just not going to allow you to do that, right? You have to pay taxes and you have to get a visa to essentially live there. Now, a lot of the times people that do this, they go on what are called visa runs. So they'll go into the country and they'll stay there for, usually it's like 90 days or whatever, 3 months. And then after that, they leave the country, say for a day or two, and then come back in order to reset their visitor's visa. And another note that I want to make, this is not necessarily a drawback for you per se, but for the people that you're affecting when you travel to these countries and essentially do this sort of thing. As the digital nomad community has grown in the past couple of years, I think it's gotten a lot bigger since COVID has started. We've seen a lot of places essentially get gentrified and have a lot of people that are coming from the US or coming from Canada or some Western world country and injecting the local economies with large amounts of money because they're coming with a stronger dollar. And this is driving out locals and increasing the amount of unaffordability in these areas. So I think if you're going to be doing something like this, it's very important to acknowledge the effect that you coming there and doing this sort of thing has on the people there, and also respect their culture and that sort of thing. And the biggest drawback that I can actually see for this is that you need a lot of money. I personally think and would not attempt to do this unless I at least had a portfolio worth $1 million, because at that net worth, if you're withdrawing 2%, you would be withdrawing around $20,000 a year, which I think is enough to get you by in some places of the world. But again, I would want a larger safety net if I'm going to be doing this, especially because of those aforementioned risks that I mentioned earlier. To continue this point, it's going to take a lot of people, the majority of people, a very long time to get that amount of money in order to do this sort of thing, which makes it unobtainable for a lot of people. Because like, say for example, you were able to get $1 million in your 40s, you probably have a family and kids by then. I don't think you're going to be wanting to go to Thailand and do visa runs. That doesn't really sound like it makes a lot of sense, right? This is where I want to loop it back to CoastFIRE and want to bring up the point that if you actually want to do this, you should be looking to getting to CoastFIRE as soon as possible. Now, again, really quickly, the idea of CoastFIRE is that you're no longer investing into your portfolio and you're letting it grow by itself. And all you are doing is getting a job or doing something in order to supplement you living, right? You're only getting a job in order to pay the bills. So with that in mind, what is to stop you from essentially pursuing a digital nomad type of life? So let's say that you're able to make $2,000 a month by doing, I don't know, one of those TikTok side hustles like copywriting or something, right? With this amount of money, you're essentially able to travel the world while still letting your portfolio grow and not taking any money out of it, mitigating a lot of the risks that I had mentioned earlier. I think doing it this way with CoastFIRE is much more attainable than doing it with regular fire. It's much easier to have $500,000 at the age of 30 than to have $1 million at the age of 30. Traveling the world is always something that I thought about doing, but if I'm being completely honest with myself, knowing myself, it's probably not something that I'm gonna do because I'm honestly too scared to pull the trigger, even if financially it would make sense for me. But sitting here making this video has prompted me to really think about how I would actually implement this if I was going to go forward and do it. Now, I think realistically what would work for me is having a sort of mini retirement where I would travel the world for like 6 months to a year, 2 years, just to see how I like it and have that be a little tester before I go on and implement or go on and commit to something as crazy as this. This isn't a guide per se, but more so a thought experiment to really help you understand what is possible in this world when you set your mind to financial independence. I truly think you can have all of it in this whole entire world, but just not all at once. As you can see, it is so important to invest while you're young in order to take advantage of things like this. But while I would argue, while you're young, investing into your 401k and all your tax advantage account is not even the most important investment you can make. And if you're curious on what I think that most important investment is, you can watch this video right here where I go over it.